I am. Matthew 19:14. Jesus said, "Let the children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these."
When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more." After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, he took the child and his mother, and he went to the land of Israel. When he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene.
Remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all Israel. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day, Lord. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the hearts of the children. So that's where we are today. We're in the intertestamental period. We talked a little bit about this morning, how there was about 400 years between the Old and the New Testament. Why silent? Well, there was a whole lot of us in that point. But does that mean there wasn't a lot that went on? The contrary. Other thing, dozens of Andrew the Greek, who basically changed the Greek culture. I'm sorry, he changed the Holy Land culture to that of a Greek culture, right? His policy was no Hellenization. The Jews rebelled against this. They rebelled against the Greek opposition, leading to their independence, which lasted till about 60 CE. This was a 20-year war known as Maccabean Revolt. And then the Roman occupation, something called the Septuagint. I'm not sure if you've heard it. It's also called the Gent, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Why is it Septuagint? Well, first of all, remember, the people who wrote the New Testament, they didn't have the same Bible. They didn't have this at their disposal, did they? They were mainly Greek speakers, but the Old Testament was in Hebrew or Aramaic. So Septuagint basically stands for, according to Jewish legend, there were about 72 people who were hired to translate the Old Testament in 72 days. If you're familiar with Roman numerals, LXX is what we see in the reference notes in the New Testament, which is the Roman number for 70. Just file that away. And then, of course, the Pharisees and Sadducees. The Pharisees that we read, they believed that, not that they were above the law, to reinterpret it. And we send an attitude toward Jesus and his verse. They were influential politically. The Sadducees, well, they were in the law, but they were in the first 5 books of the Old Testament called the Torah. But the thing about the Sadducees did not believe in life after death, which is why they were sad, you see. Okay, so there were 100 years between. So is that it for story, right? We can just go home and so we learned all about the Bible in 2 weeks. It's amazing. Well, not so fast, my friends. Because remember, the people that were alive, they had been promised a Messiah for all this time. The kingdom had the show for it. Not probably of in that area right then. Little did know, the under Nazareth, God's for the way to say, we don't know for sure, if Jesus was a carpenter. We know he was a carpenter's son, but we don't know certain that 3 wise men for the sermon to carpenter. Now, he worked with this. He was a blue-collar. Amazing, you look at this image, and it's like, wow, this is on the image of the photographer, isn't it? Sounds like, I don't know, a director from Teacherville, or Escatorford. Sounds. So, before you laugh, if you could see in the picture, we've got a Christmas tree, Christmas decorations, 190 away. That's thinking of getting gifts on, because sales are going to come in now. So as let's get this now. We think of girls and all the thinking and together out together. But these little groups that our children separate. The main point I want to talk about. Number 1 is the flight to Egypt. 2, the curves in, and then we talk. This guy, they have some trying to get what going on. He still knew there. I just want to lay down and realize. Again, so brimming with pride. Proud papa, right? Totally aware. Her evil scheme. He can well deserve rest. I can kind of drift into just a beautiful sleep with his child in his right, and then find from him black. Angel of the Lord of Joseph. He takes out in his escaped to stare. I tell Herod as a child to kill. Now I have a lot of dreams in my life, but I can never imagine like going. He might open up such jolts. Anyway, a good thing for us. Got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, if you'll notice with Matthew speaks often of prophecies being fulfilled. And even in today's text, there are a few of them. And here's the first one. The first one is from a prophet called Hosea, which is part of the Old Testament. And in chapter 11 of Hosea, verse 1, the entire verse is this. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So it's a little different there. But as he does with Jeremiah, Matthew selects events in Jesus' early life that were foretold prophets. Again, Matthew was not just some schlub that Jesus found in the middle of the street. This is a smart man who was a brilliant storyteller and a great writer. And he knew his were Jewish Christians that spoke. So he had to get through to them. More important than anything else, proof that Jesus was the Old Testament. Because I don't know everybody understands for a moment. Now, they originally referred to God's calling the nation Egypt when this gospel. He applies it to Jesus, comparing the two. He basically equates the birth of a nation in Egypt. Led out Egypt. God led Jesus out of it eventually. The next part of this text is very disturbing. I'm not going to lie. The first time when I was a newborn, a little over 5.5 years, and I get to the part, and it's brutal, and I'm thinking, this is the most violent I've ever read. Like, I'm so bad guy. No, Chris. Now, I'm testing all things like 21 would are bare and cruel and tragic. Interesting. The other day said spreading corruption was his charge. And on to fierce for Pastor Irani, who since years in forced in activities. Tehran, what we do in other places. We have to understand the who gospel and it's good. May you this as we look as we told Beth just from down children suddenly replaced by the and it's his smile, his utter amazement. You expect to see him later that day. And as your little toddler crawls in another room, exploring his things, you certainly pull back. When you feed your baby boy breakfast, you don't expect that to be his final meal. And I'm sure that's what the others were in that dreadful day. Then, what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no. Strong statement. You can almost picture mothers hiding their children, listening to the awful knocks of soldiers knocking in the doors. Shh, don't speak. Not even a word. They can hear you. The slaughter of children. This doesn't grow up. Good old Dr. Luke. He wasn't a Jew. Anything this, but when Luke did, and boy, their Christmases couldn't have been much more different. Luke writes about a pregnant Elizabeth being filled with the Holy Spirit. Matthew writes about Joseph getting ready to divorce his pregnant wife. Luke's Christmas included a celebration. Matthew writes about a weeping Rachel, who had already been dead for about 1,600 years. Luke was interested in angels. Matthew was much more concerned with the devil. Luke doesn't even mention King Herod in his account, but in Matthew's account, he is the main antagonist. Luke inspires us to proclaim the good news to all. Matthew reminds us that the good news has enemies, so be careful. Luke's Christmas included hymns such as the Magnificat, Gloria and Excelsis Deo, and Nunc Dimittis. The final song was a song of praise by a man named Simeon. Luke's Christmas, his guests weren't singing. Luke's guests were singing. In Matthew's Christmas, the guests were literally for lives in the dark of night. Luke's story was about love, peace, and joy, while Matthew focused on survival, anguish, and utter heartbreak. Matthew ends his story not with fanfare and celebration, rather with weeping and mourning. So as we move on, after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. What is it with Joseph and his dreams, right? First, he dreams, the angel tells him to go to Egypt. Now, go to Israel, because Herod was no longer a threat. So he was about to do that. Finally, well, you know what? Forget about Judea. Go to Galilee, because Herod's son is in charge there, and you want no part of this guy. So by now, again, doesn't the family just want to relax? Can you imagine right after giving birth, or even if it's a couple years later, you just want to relax. You're sick of running around. And do any of us ever feel like this, that we're just constantly running from the devil? It's amazing. If you look at that final sentence there, so was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. These exact words, actually, not found anywhere in the Old Testament. However, it could have been a combination of predictions. If you think of another prophet, Isaiah, in chapter 11, verse 1, he says that a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. So what does that branch refer to? Well, the coming ruler in the Davidic line. If you're familiar at all with Revelation, in chapter 22, verse 16, Jesus says, "I am the root and the offspring of David." This is all starting to make sense as a continuous story. And by the way, we say that if we're from America, we're Americans. If you're from Italy, you're an Italian. So what's the big deal about being called a Nazarene? Doesn't mean a whole lot the first time you read that, does it? Until you realize that Nazarene, the word Nazarene, was basically a synonym for despised. And it's interesting that Isaiah, later in his prophecy, states that he would be despised and rejected by mankind. You know how many times Nazareth is mentioned in the entire Old Testament? 0. Not once. It's almost like, in a way, God was ashamed of it. I think the point is that Matthew is illustrating that this was not a fairy tale, not by any means. And indeed, as we know, as we read, the Messiah would be a despised person from a small town in the middle of nowhere. Okay, how do we apply this? Well, first of all, we need to understand that no, you don't hear preachers talk about this stuff a whole heck of a lot. I mean, when you woke up this morning, did you want to be reminded that people hate you and you're going to have to deal with adversity? I didn't. As Christians, we just don't want to deal with his opposition, do we? It's just easier for us to say, you know what? I'm not going to talk to anyone about religion. I'm going to keep it under wraps. I'll keep it in my house, talk to my family about it, and no one else. I don't need anyone else to know that I'm a Christian. I really hope that is not your attitude. This is what we were called to do. We knew this was going to happen. Humble beginnings, even for the Savior. He came to earth in form of a man, but it's not like God set him up in the Ritz-Carlton. It's not like Christ was followed by a bunch of personal assistants who would help his every move. And just like it was 2,000 years ago, world leaders today, they're opposed to the kingdom of God. Think about back then. Herod, who was an insanely jealous ruler, just completely lost his mind once baby Jesus was born. And then later, Herod Antipas had John the Baptist imprisoned and beheaded. Later still, the Pharisees and leaders of Israel plotted to have Jesus killed, which of course they did. After that, they said, oh, wow, there may have been a resurrection after all. So we're going to cover this up too. And even when Jesus was technically out of the picture, at least on earth, even at the beginning of Acts, during the beginning of the church time, they were persecuted as well. Think of Peter, think of Stephen, think of Paul, think of John. Think of you today. We're still being persecuted. They did all they could do to squash the gospel and make sure that no one knew about it. It didn't work, did it? Because, and this is the one point, if you don't remember anything I'm saying today, remember this. Despite Satan's best efforts, the show will go on. God's will advances no matter what. And here's the great thing about being a believer. No matter how hard of a day you're having, if you're having some physical issues, some mental problems, emotional distress, financial, we know how this ends. We know the ending to our story. And it ends very well, doesn't it? If you're at all familiar with Revelation, you know that in the end, God's kingdom wins. And if you are part of that kingdom, you're going to be on the winning side. Jesus lived in a town despised by many, made a living in the manual labor industry, wasn't that highly thought of. And according to Paul in his letter to the Philippians, he said, Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Nevertheless, despite all these early struggles, he ended up obviously doing wonderful things, not as a rebel, but as someone who obeyed his Father. It's the same Father that we need to obey. If Jesus could obey God, then why in the world can't we? Christ was despised and rejected by men. As his disciples, we should be expected to be despised and rejected by men. No, we're probably not going to be crucified. At least I hope not. Persecution comes in different forms and different waves. But you know what? It could be worse. I mean, what if there was no John 3:16? What if God did not so love the world? What if God did not send his only begotten Son? I mean, this is a God who did not have to send his Son, but he did because he loves you. He willingly sent his Son to heal the lame, to heal the blind, to heal broken hearts. 2,000 years ago and today as well. And how magnificent is this whole idea of God becoming human? I mean, do you take that for granted? And when you pray in the morning or at night or whenever, does it ever register in your mind that, wow, God came to earth in human form? And how lucky were the guys back then who got to talk to Jesus Christ. Got to talk to God in human form. That's a special time. But we know with all the wickedness, with all the sin, with all the depravity, Jesus Christ came to us in a real world. Back then, it was like that. Now, it is like that. It's a world of pain. It's a world of death. It's a world of suffering and evil. This is the world that we all understand, at least in some way. And in conclusion, we know that Matthew's version of the Christmas story has a lot to say as we encounter adversity. It's not the Christmas story we want to hear. It's not the Christmas story I'm going to go home and tell the kids about. But it's the Christmas story we need. You need to hear this. A preacher does not come up here and tell you things that you necessarily want to hear. He comes up here and tells you what you need to hear. And there is a big difference sometimes. It almost makes me tear up reading about this and knowing what happened for our benefit. It really does. And as Matthew, as devastating as this particular passage was in his gospel, as depressing as his Christmas account was, he also reminds us a chapter earlier that God is Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And that news surpasses any of the negativity. When we can't find him, God is with us. God is with our young people as they struggle to find their identity, as they struggle to sit and think, man, do I really want to go to church or should I hang out with my friends on Sunday? God is with us when our sorrow is so overwhelming, when our grief, when our anguish, and our pain just blinds us from his light. God is with us when death stares us right between the eyes. God is with us when a loved one is taken from us, only to feel his embrace in heaven. Whatever or whoever is taken from us, whatever we lack here, let's remember one thing that as Christians we will always have, and that's hope. It's hope. And it's times like these when we encounter adversity that we need to show that everything that we believe about hope and faith is more than just lip service. This is our time to act. This is our time to believe. Again, it might not be in God's plan for you to be a happy-go-lucky man or woman. It might not be God's plan for you to be the most successful guy or girl on your block. It might not be his plan for you to have 5 healthy children and everybody goes to a good college. But one thing I will say, it is his plan to make you faithful. He calls us all to be faithful Christians. Jesus Christ walks with in a beautiful world, yet sometimes cruel one, to suffer with us, to walk with us, and to ultimately take us home. I want to end with a story. It's been told that in a Russian orphanage, there were about 100 boys and girls who had been abused and abandoned. Like the babies of Bethlehem, they had experienced the violence of our world. With amazement, they heard the Christmas story for the first time. So following the story, the children were given small pieces of cardboard to make a manger. They tore up a paper napkin for straw and were given a small doll cut out of felt. So in next to no time, 6-year-old Misha finished his project, not with one baby, but with 2 babies in the manger. So when Misha was asked why he had 2 babies in the manger, he replied by retelling the story of Jesus in his own words, where Mary had put the baby Jesus in the manger. He said, "When Mary laid the baby in the manger, Jesus looked at me and asked me if I had a place to stay. I told him no, because I have no mama and I have no papa, so I don't have any place to stay. Then Jesus told me I could stay with him, but I told him I couldn't, because I didn't have a gift to give him like the Magi did. But I wanted to stay with Jesus so badly. So I thought about what I had that maybe I could use for a gift. I thought maybe if I keep him warm, that would be a good gift. So I asked Jesus, Jesus, if I keep you warm, will I be able to stay with you? Will that be an okay gift? And the Lord replied, if you keep me warm, that will be the best gift I have ever received. So I got into the manger, and then Jesus looked at me, and he told me I could stay with him for always. That's how he said it, for always. As little Misha finished his story, his eyes brimmed full of tears that splashed down his little cheeks. Putting his hand over his face, his head dropped to the table, and his shoulders shook as he sobbed and sobbed. The little orphan had found someone who would never abandon nor abuse him, someone who would stay with him for always. In the suffering and pain of our lives, in the violence in our world, Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us for always. And as we close, some of you might not know God in a personal way. Some of you might not understand that God is with you for always. Some of you might have forgotten that a big, bad, brutal, powerful King Herod was no match whatsoever for the baby of Bethlehem. Some of you have not yet understood that the broken pieces of your life can fit right into Jesus' more than capable hands, and he can make that into a beautiful masterpiece. If you have not yet made a commitment to Christ, I invite you today to do so. And if you are interested, while we stand and sing, please come up, or you can talk to one of us